All right, let's talk a little about the strategy going forward. I'm covering a good bit of ground here with different sorts of bands, and I definitely want to revisit some of these bands, but for now, I'm picking different ones. So I'm kind of staking out a perimeter, and eventually I'll be forced to talk about the same band again. And at that point, we'll know that my work here is about halfway done, at least until I shift gears and start talking about Mayan pottery instead of collecting old music. Who knows? This time, I want to talk about yet another different sort of band, and not an industrial band, not completely electronic, but definitely alternative. A cult band, if you will. A band known for their dark associations, even though their standard contract writer reportedly prohibited the use of a certain four-letter word that starts with G and rhymes with moth. I wonder if you can figure out what that word is. A band that, despite their pretensions and affectations, managed to produce some truly great music in the 1980s. A band who have become rock iconoclasts. They have proven that they aren't afraid to do their own thing, even if it's to their detriment sometimes, or if it's to the disappointment of their fans. And I'm using plurals here, but this is yet another band operated by an individual with help from a couple hired hands. The individual in question is one Andrew Taylor. No, not Andy Taylor, the former guitarist for Duran Duran, and not Andrew Taylor, the manager of Iron Maiden, and definitely not Andrew C. Taylor, the CEO of Enterprise Rent-A-Car. I'm talking about Andrew William Harvey Taylor, who's known professionally as Andrew Eldritch, and his band of 43 years and counting, the Sisters of Mercy. And in particular, I'd like to discuss their sophomore album, which they released in 1987, Floodland. So let me talk a little about the time I first heard the Sisters of Mercy. And to do that, let's step back into the Wayback Machine, and as we often do, we'll set it to the fall of 1990 when I was in high school. Again, if I had a clique, it was probably the Art Nerds. And as a group, we were into a lot of the bands I've been talking about in this show. My friends definitely were not goth, but I suppose you could say we dabbled. And now that I think of it, there were really no hardcore goths in my school. We were a little too backwoods for that. There might have been a little black lipstick here and there, and maybe, a little too much eyeliner, but no one was wearing corpse paint or anything. But, kids experiment, and one day a buddy of mine played me this goth CD. He was like, "Here, try this, kid. You'll like it." And sure enough, I did. And it was Floodland. And this record had pretty much everything I was looking for at the time. It had a good beat, it had hooks, it had a bit of aggression and energy. And needless to say, we all taped it in short order, and it became a part of our soundtrack to endlessly driving around town. To this day, I strongly associate this album to wintertime, and not just because one of the songs is called Driven Like the Snow. To me, it invokes that winter of 1990 to 91. Of all the music we were listening to around that time, Floodland was more accessible than most, I could say. You could play it for parents and regular people, and they might appreciate it. It wouldn't really put them off the way Skinny Puppy or, like, PTP's Rubber Glove Seduction would. It was essentially rock music with some fancy production and, an unexpected, beautiful piano ballad. So let's talk about the band. Who were the Sisters of Mercy? Again, this was largely pre-internet days when we started listening to them. Still the dark ages, if you will. Let me put on these shades because it's the dark ages. There you go. So the Sisters' liner notes were pretty good, and they gave us all the basics. They said Floodland was written by Andrew Eldritch, but didn't really present a band lineup at all, and to us that was puzzling. We didn't know what to make of that, and we saw that they were from Leeds, which was in England, we figured. not terribly sophisticated. We didn't know where Leeds was exactly. Turns out it wasn't terribly far from Manchester, and we didn't really know where that was either, not exactly, but we knew that it was in the north part of the country, whereas London was in the south. That's about all we knew. Someone or other picked up their first album, which was First and Last and Always, and in here it showed a picture of 4 guys, so we figured that those guys were the band. Makes sense. We were a little confused that one of the band members was listed as Dr. Avalanche. And at first we figured he was a pretentious guy with a cool name to hide insecurities, kind of like Bono or The Edge or maybe even Andrew Eldritch. But it turned out that it was just the name they gave to their drum machine. And except for their very first single, which none of us had, the Sisters of Mercy never had a real drummer, even on the first album. Drums were always credited to Dr. Avalanche, who was always a drum machine. I guess that's an example of British humor. But then we saw Andrew on 120 Minutes on MTV, and we gradually began to piece together that the band was just him, maybe with Patricia Morrison on bass, because she did appear on the cover of Floodland anyway, so was involved in some fashion. But it was clear to us that the band had changed personnel at some point. Now, when I went to college and got on the internet, I got the rest of the story. Turns out the band broke up after recording the first album and about 2 more albums worth of singles and B-sides. And those were all, for the most part, regular rock songs, albeit with Andrew's almost comically deep singing voice. I mean, awesome singing voice. It is an awesome voice. I'm just joking around. There are good songs, but in my mind, these early songs were often overshadowed by what I thought was tinny production. So the first album was somewhat better in that regard than the singles, but, not by much. There were some remastered editions of the early tracks, at least, but there was one compilation album that had a bunch of B-sides called Some Girls Wonder by Mistake. But another album's worth of those tracks remain uncollected to this day, except I did see that some are available on Apple Music if you buy the new First and Last and Always album on there. But why is that? Why were they uncollected for so long? Well, it speaks to what I said before about this band being iconoclastic. They either had no desire to collect those tracks, or the company that did have the rights had no desire to collect them. In recent decades, like I said, some of these extra singles have been thrown onto the remastered albums, but not all and not in every format. I've found that more of these tracks do appear, at least on Apple Music, which is something I have access to, than on the actual CDs anymore. So take that as you may. Depending on who you ask, the former members either quit or Andrew executed a power play to take control of the band. The other 3 guys were going to rename themselves as the Sisterhood, kind of as a way, I guess, to diminish the value of the Sisters brand or confuse listeners. But Andrew beat them to it by recording and releasing his own album as the Sisterhood, which he called Gift. And here it is. So I like this album as an example of weaponized art. He recorded an entire album only to get the rights to the band name. And it's important here and crucial here to note that in German, gift means poison. So that was beautifully done, if hastily done, but in retrospect, Gift would end up being a taster of sorts for Floodland. And one of the tracks here on Gift is called Colors, and it would carry over to the next album. By the way, I should mention that Gift is being re-released as I speak in 2023. This is according to Slicing Up Eyeballs, and I believe them implicitly. So if you're interested in this recording, please check that out. The net result of this whole thing was that the former Sisters members were forced to pick another band name, so they ended up becoming The Mission. And I'm not a fan of the Mission. I have never listened to the Mission, so I have nothing to say about them at all. Meanwhile, Andrew began work on the next Proper Sisters release, which would effectively be a solo album. And that brings us to Floodland. So like I said, he recruited Patricia Morrison, who was formerly a bassist for the Gun Club. However, there is some dispute over whether she actually did any writing or playing that ended up on this album. Andrew claims that she did not. But clearly she did appear in all the videos of the time and on some public performances, or I guess probably lip syncing of the songs. So she was definitely a visual presence in the band, if not actually on the record. As far as actual songwriting, Andrew partnered with a guy named Larry Alexander, and for production he went to Jim Steinman. And Steinman, of course, had made his mark at this point, making big bombastic pop schmaltz with Meatloaf's Bat Outta Hell albums and Bonnie Tyler's Total Eclipse of the Heart, and everyone's favorite, Air Supply. So for better or worse, that guy now turned his attentions to the Sisters of Mercy. Obviously, the results here were positive, or I wouldn't be talking about them. Some of his touches were heavier than others, as we'll see, but overall, Floodland is less straight-up rock than the first album. I find it covers a wider range of styles. It has dance music, it has atmospherics, these weird quasi-instrumentals, and again, that piano ballad. The whole thing flows very well as an album. It's like an arranged suite, almost like a musical. And production-wise, it sounds huge, which was Steinman's trademark after all. And I find this record does have a lot of reverb, even in 1987 terms. But let's look at it here track by track. Starts off really solidly with Dominion and Mother Russia. This is the track that got me hooked, folks, and it's probably my overall favorite Sisters of Mercy track. It's got an excellent groove, has an outstanding repeated guitar hook, which, by the way, is trivial to play. The sax solo at the end is just mwah. The ending segues very smoothly into Mother Russia, which is essentially just another verse about nuclear war that's tacked onto the end, along with a final chorus with different words. And in a way, it's very uplifting, in a goth kind of way. Flood 1 is much slower. It's a mostly synth-driven song that begins this recurring theme of water. Has some really interesting sounds on it. Lucretia, My Reflection is practically a disco track. It's just really a beat and a bass line. But it gets a bit more complicated and louder in the middle, and then it gets quiet again. So again, nice dynamics. That's an excellent thing about listening to this, is that it really covers the full dynamic range. This is probably my second favorite track after Dominion, and as ever, I'm attracted to the groovy fast tracks. That's what gets me going. 1959, this is the piano ballad. This is the track that really surprised us as kids listening to this. And listening to it then, I had a very hard time imagining somebody playing that piano piece so perfectly. Now, of course, I think about it, and I figure any reasonably talented pianist could pull it off if they had the printed music and some time to practice, but at the time it really impressed me. It seemed like an incredibly complex piece of music, and it sounded so perfect. So just imagine my disappointment when I learned what MIDI was. So yeah, Andrew Eldridge had programmed the whole thing, but I'm not sure if it was recorded using a real piano, just playing it like a player piano, or if they just used samples, but it sounds real to me. It sounds like a real piano, and there are excellent dynamics throughout that piece. Softer and louder notes. Sounds great. And anyway, Andrew wrote that song in response to a fan who asked him why he never sang over piano. And evidently her name was Isabel, which is why she's mentioned in the lyrics, which is pretty cool. And as for 1959 itself, that was the year that Andrew Eldridge was born. That leads into This Corrosion. This was Steinman's Pièce de la Résistance, a full choir, harpsichord, lightning, thunder, cats and dogs, mass hysteria. 11 minutes of complete over-the-topness. That song is definitely not my thing. It's a good song at its core, I think, but to me it kind of steps over the line into, I don't know, like absurd self-parody. The video is just more of the same. I mean, what can you say about it? I applaud its complete insanity, I guess, but it's not a track I find myself listening to very often. Flood 2 is a nice track. It's more of an acoustic guitar-driven take on Flood 1, and it continues the water theme. And I like to think of these two tracks as kind of like a river flowing through the album. But overall, I prefer it to Flood 1. And if I had to put this in terms of Pink Floyd, I would say that there's a clear parallel here, because Flood 1 is to Another Brick of the Wall Part 2, as Flood 2 is to Another Brick in the Wall Part 3. So just add one, folks. It really does make sense. I'm serious here. Like, go and listen to them. It's the same relationship. Two different albums. Driven Like the Snow, another favorite of mine, because I love long songs that have hypnotic bass lines. And I read somewhere that Andrew said that that track was a sequel of sorts to 9 While 9 on the first album. And I can see that, because the bass line here is very similar to the top guitar melody in 9 While 9. It's just modified a bit. And I should say, as a guitar hobbyist, I spend a lot of time, and have spent a lot of time in my life, playing along to all sorts of tracks and trying to figure them out. And, of course, what I soon realized is that it didn't take a lot of guitar heroics to play most of my favorite songs. That's the nice thing about popular music, folks. You don't need to be a virtuoso to get the point across. It really is, in a lot of cases, 3 chords with an attitude. Anyway, this song is also water-related, albeit with frozen water, I guess. That brings us to Neverland, a fragment. This is another favorite of mine. Can all of these tracks be favorites? I guess, except for this Corrosion. It looks that way. Yeah, anyway, this is a fragment because it's just a snippet of a longer song. The full-length version is about 12 minutes and has been released in years since on the remastered edition of this record. I suspect it was cut down here to fit on vinyl, and I prefer the full version. Before I heard the full version, I interpreted the title as a place name, like, Never Never Land. But after hearing the lyrics of the full version, I realized that it means to never come down to earth. I forget where I read it now, but Andrew Eldridge has explained this song as a sort of dream he had of flying through millions of miles of space towards the earth, only to hit it and come out the other side, and then continue the journey with endless more miles to go. So, never land. Pretty cool imagery in my mind, and it comes through when you listen to the song. Finally, we have the so-called bonus tracks. I've read conflicting reports as to whether he meant for these to be included. Who knows the truth, but these are only on the CD and the, I guess, the downloadable versions. According to legend, Torch is the song that his former bandmates refused to play because it was just too complicated. It doesn't sound too complicated to me, but it's a pretty simple, slow song, a Torch song, if you will. And that's a pun that he uses to pretty good effect here. Torch was originally a B-side to this Corrosion. Finally, Colors. A very, very slight reworking of the track that appeared on the Gift album by the Sisterhood, which was also a B-side to this Corrosion. And as I said, the 2006 reissue of Floodland includes the full-length version of Neverland and also a cover of Emma by Hot Chocolate that was originally, I think, a B-side on some editions of Dominion. And that brings us to some of the singles here. The first single from this record was This Corrosion, backed with Torch and Colors. I don't actually have that. The next single was Dominion, which I do have. This is on a CD3, and for some reason I've always loved CD3s. I have no idea why, but for some reason they put these little extenders on them. I guess because some of the CD3s weren't playable in certain CD players. So this one is funny in that it sort of emulates vinyl, which is silly in my mind. But anyway, this single has 4 tracks. The first is Dominion, which is minus Mother Russia. The second track is called Untitled. It's just a snippet of Dominion with a sax solo slowed down. Pretty sure that's all it is. Sandstorm is the third track. It's just an ambient piece that was constructed from different sax parts overlaid on each other. It's kind of cool. And the last track is the funniest. It's Ozymandias, which is literally the entire Dominion track just played backwards. I don't know. That's pretty strange. It might be a joke, I figure, based on the poem Ozymandias by Shelley, which essentially describes a situation that's the exact opposite of a dominion. But I don't know. That's just my guess, personally. The last single from this record was Lucretia, My Reflection, backed with Long Train. That's just an extended version of Train, which was a B-side on the Body and Soul EP from 1984. So let's talk about why I love this record. Like I said, I do like some of the earlier Sisters tracks with the full band. Temple of Love was their big hit, of course. That song, what's not to like, you know? I can tell you that Temple of Love sounds great played at top volume in a club on Goth Night. But some of the tunes on their first album I think were also really, really good. Black Planet, Marion, 9 While 9, they all come to mind. Again, my problem with these is more in the production. They just didn't sound very full. There wasn't enough bass. The sounds were all kind of mushed together in my mind. But Floodland eliminated that problem, to say the least. I think this Corrosion is probably overproduced, if anything. But still, even with the extra 80s reverb, this recording really shines. And I also like that it goes beyond them just being a rock band. I like the other instrumentation, the piano, the sax, the synths, the extra keyboard. I should point out that with the Sisters, Dr. Avalanche never really sounded like a drum machine. It just sounded like a pretty unimaginative rock drummer. But they always used real rock drum sounds, and they always went with the samples and nothing that sounded too electronic or artificial. So they did kind of sound like a rock band, but here they really extended that instrumentation in other ways. With this album, the songs aren't really mixed as rock songs, so the drums are really punchy, the bass is really deep, and everything is riding on top of that. So there's a huge dynamic range. Clearly, a track like Lucretia, My Reflection is mixed for a club, and it doesn't sound like it was recorded on a stage or like a live rock band. And that, to me, that clarity is really great to hear. I'm not going to sit here and say it's an audiophile album, because I'm not a freaking audiophile, people. I'm just a guy who's, spent the last 25 years listening to MP3s in his car. But this record played on good speakers gives me that audiophile kind of vibe. The first album definitely doesn't do that. The other thing that makes this the best Sisters album, in my opinion, is that it works great as an album. The track sequence gives you bursts of energy and pauses to recover. There are up-tempo and down-tempo tracks. And listening to this whole album is like going on a journey. And if you've watched the video for Dominion, that journey might have been to the city of Petra in Jordan while wearing a white suit and Top Gun shades. I don't know. So where are they now? The band's still active in their own way. Again, bands composed of primarily one person and a drum machine have a way of going on and on and on as long as that person wants it to go on. And that's definitely the case here. The whole lack of band politics thing is a wonderful thing for longevity. But they exist as a touring band only. After Floodland, they had released just one more studio album Vision thing in 1990. I was less enthusiastic about this because it seemed to me that it squared off the dynamics and experimentation of Floodland and left more of a cookie cutter set of formulaic pop songs. They were all very verse, chorus, verse, and they all lasted about 4 minutes, except the big hit, More, which of course was produced by Jim Steinman. So Andrew reached back into the bag and pulled out Jim Steinman to produce one more single. And of course that's the single that got onto MTV and kind of carried the album. But overall, I didn't think that it had very many new musical ideas on it. I sensed that the band, which now consisted of Andrew and 4 hired guitarists, including Tony James of Sig Sig Sputnik, were just like desperate for ideas. There was one new single after this, which was Under the Gun. They released in 1993. But after that, the sisters would record no more. All the releases after that point were compilations or reissues. And that's not quite true because Andrew would get into a feud with his label, East West Records, and he'd end up recording a second album, again, as a corporate weapon. This was the second after the whole sisterhood fiasco. And this time, it would be an album of hastily recorded techno music with no drums and vocals, and he would call it Go Figure. But it pointedly was not a sisters album. The band name he gave was this huge acronym beginning with SSV that reportedly, allegedly, when expanded, meant Screw Shareholder Value, Not So Much a Band as Another Opportunity to Waste Money on Drugs and Ammunition Courtesy of the Idiots at Time Warner. So East West refused to release that, obviously, but they did release him from his record contract. But as for True Sisters recordings, there were no more after this. And why is that? It's not that they haven't written new songs. In fact, they've written 2 or 3 albums worth, and they regularly play them on tour. You can go to their website and see that list along with all the lyrics. So fans know which songs are which. There's just no record to buy. And he's given a variety of reasons for why that is over the years. 1, he couldn't find a record deal to finance a record to his satisfaction. 2, the people who co-wrote the songs had left the band. And 3, his falling out with East West made him gun-shy about signing with anyone else. And 4, recording just cost too much in this new post-Napster music industry, and there's no point to it. And of all of his arguments, not that he needed to make them to anyone or justify what he was doing or not doing to anyone, but that last point made the most sense to me, because the fact is, it's obvious to everyone that music is now a cost-free thing. Listeners don't pay artists to hear music. Listeners download it through file sharing, or they hear it on YouTube for free, or they pay Spotify to hear it, and Spotify pays artists millionths of a penny per stream. So only the top 0.1% of artists ever actually see money from listeners buying their music. If you're an artist and you're lucky enough to get vinyl pressed in this day and age with the ridiculous vinyl manufacturing backlog, thanks Adele, then you might make some cash on selling to vinyl collectors, but it's not enough to pay for your boat. And really, today, a working band's income comes from touring, and thanks to COVID, that's also come to a screeching halt for a few years. And, most pro bands probably have, except the most successful, probably have day jobs these days. Music is just a non-starter. And if I had to guess, I would guess that Andrew Eldritch has a day job in IT. And on his website, he lists Debian Linux as his stage equipment, and he professed a love for interactive fiction. So sounds like a classic IT guy to me. So you folks in IT, take another look at your bald coworker with the deep voice and shades and ask yourself, could that business analyst really be the front man for the Sisters of Mercy? So yeah, I get it. The sisters aren't recording anymore. It's a bummer though, because I don't get to go to many shows these days. I imagine some fans do though. And for sure, as long as there are goths, there will be fans to fill up a sister's show. I should say that as I speak here in February 2023, they're about to embark on their first U.S. tour in 14 years. It'll be in May and June of this year. So catch them if you can. Who knows how much longer they'll be out there doing it. Who knows? But there you have it, kids. The Sisters of Mercy, Floodland. If you dig this, stick around. I got a lot more music to talk about. This is Stronger Than Reason, and we're available on YouTube and as a podcast, wherever you do that podcast thing. And if you like what you heard, I guess like and subscribe, because it helps other people figure out that this thing exists. And I should say I'm just one dude with an opinion, often a wrong opinion, so consider correcting it in a comment. Or better yet, start your own show. I did. Anyone can do it. It's an easy thing to do. Until next time, stay strong.